Lovely to be back, and thank you for inviting me again. The last time I was here was the beginning of May. It was 3 weeks after the book came out, and it was a really enjoyable evening. I loved it. I've done more than 70 events over the past year. You're the first one I've done twice, so that's a nice thing. It's a privilege to be back again. When I was last here, I covered 180 million years of Northern history. Tonight, so it's a different focus. I'm going to cover just 20 of the most interesting characters I came across when I was researching and writing the book. It's not comprehensive. I've left out some of those I talked about last time, but I hope you'll find it an interesting selection. I am going to do them roughly in date order, because otherwise it seems a bit random. Now we'll find out whether my slides are going to work. But to start off with, I showed this slide. It's my standard disclaimer for the people who ask me these questions: where is the North and what is a Northerner? And I can afford to take a very liberal, inclusive view. So to me, the North is where the people who live in a place think they're in the North, not where somebody else thinks they are. And a Northerner is simply somebody who thinks of themselves as a Northerner, whether born in the region or not. I'm not going to go too deeply into prehistory this time, but we'll start with Lindo Man here, otherwise known as Pete Marsh. He was discovered in 1984, having preserved in Lindo Moss, a Cheshire peat bog. He's thought to have died around the 1st century AD or CE, in either the Iron Age or the Romano-British period. He was about 25 years old. He was of robust frame. He was bearded and naked, apart from a fox fur band around his left arm. He appears to have been of high social rank because he has manicured fingernails that showed he'd done little manual work. After a last meal of charred bread, he suffered blows to the head. He may have been garroted. He swallowed mistletoe and was deposited face down in the bog. He also had a possible stab wound to the neck and a broken neck, which is what finally killed him. Why he met this grim fate is unclear, but a leading theory is that this was a ritual human sacrifice, a practice outlawed by the Romans. He could also have been the victim of a violent crime or an executed criminal. Now, Lindo Man became a celebrity in the 1980s because it marked the first discovery in Britain of a well-preserved bog body. Its condition was comparable to that of Gorbala Man in Ireland and Tollen Man from Denmark. He wasn't the only bog body to have been found in that moss. Lindo Woman was discovered the year before. We don't know if she was related, I think. And other body parts have also been discovered there. And he's displayed in the British Museum, despite a campaign to keep him in Manchester. Moving on to the Romans, let's talk about Emperor Septimius Severus. It's a bit presumptuous to call him a Northerner. He only spent 3 years here, and we don't know what he thought about that, but he's not around to argue. Some 6 or possibly 7 Roman emperors visited northern England while they were holding supreme power. Hadrian was the first to come to start building his wall, and Severus was the second. He's sometimes known as the African emperor. He was the mixed-race son of a provincial family from present-day Libya. He ruled the empire from York for 3 years from 208 until he died there in 211. He came to Britain with his wife Julia and his sons Caracalla and Geta, who were designated as successors. He arrived possibly in response to a barbarian rebellion, though he may also have been seeking to remove his unruly sons from Rome's temptations. Leaving Geta to handle the administration in southern Britain, Severus and Caracalla based themselves at York and fought 2 campaigns in Caledonia without ever fully subduing the local tribes. And then Severus died while he was preparing for a third invasion, and he was cremated in York. The two brothers, Caracalla and Geta, then became joint emperors, which Severus probably hoped would end their bitter rivalry. Caracalla, in fact, became one of the most cruel and tyrannical emperors. On his father's death, he ordered the execution of imperial household attendants. Some 30 decapitated male skeletons found at Driffield Terrace in York in 2004 may have been the victims. On returning to Rome, Caracalla killed Geta, who died clinging to his mother. Let's hope the current dispute in our royal family doesn't end in the same way. Sticking with the Romans, this is somebody nicknamed Ivory Bangle Lady. It's a skeleton found in Sycamore Terrace, York, in 1901. It was a high-status adult woman, probably of North African descent, who died at York in the 4th century. She was in a stone sarcophagus with luxury goods, suggesting high social status. One bracelet was of African ivory. An analysis indicates that she is likely to have been of mixed race, and that she, her parents, or her grandparents had come from North Africa. She was between 18 and 23 when she died, and she was one of 200 human skeletons that have been analysed from the Roman era in York. While most were of European ancestry, some 11 or 12% were of African descent. They were spread across 2 burial grounds, one for poorer and one for wealthier people, suggesting that they moved in all levels of society. Moving on to the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Northumbria, where Bede, a Benedictine monk who lived from 673 to 735, is widely seen as the foremost scholar of early medieval Europe. He's the only Englishman that was mentioned in Dante's Paradiso. He was England's first historian and its only native doctor of the Catholic Church. Apart from his ecclesiastical history of the English people, Bede wrote more than 60 works of science, cosmology, biblical commentary, hagiography, orthography, poetic meter, and the reckoning of time. He knew the earth was round and wrote about how it influenced the changing length of daylight. He had a leading role in spreading the Anno Domini, or Year of Our Lord, system of dating from Christ's birth, and he worked out how the tides worked and why times varied along the same coast. He was probably from a noble family, and he was placed at age 7 in the monk Wearmouth Jarrow monastery. While in some ways Bede seems very modern, in others his worldview was quite different to our own, notably his emphasis on miracles, visions, and incorruptible bodies. Also in the kingdom of Northumbria, Hilda, or Hild, who lived from 614 to 680, was a Christian saint and the founding abbess of the monastery at Whitby. Northumbria didn't have any female rulers, but the growth of the monasteries created career opportunities for aristocratic women who were not destined to be queens. She was the great niece of King Edwin. According to Bede, she was the most religious handmaid of Christ, and her reputation for wisdom was such that not only meaner men in their need, but sometimes even kings and princes sought and received her counsel. The abbey was home to both monks and nuns. Bede praises Hilda for justice, piety, chastity, and other virtues, particularly of peace and charity. No one there was rich and none poor, for they had all things common, and none had any private property. At the Synod of Whitby, King Oswy decided between Roman and Irish Christianity. Hilda sided with the Irish, but accepted the result after Oswy ruled in favour of the Roman version. Local folklore says she turned a plague of snakes to stone and threw them off the cliff, which is probably a medieval explanation for the ammonite fossils that are found in the rocks around Whitby. A Victorian geologist named an ammonite species after her called Hildrosseras, and she's a patron of schools and colleges around the world, including St Hilda's College, Oxford. Leap forward a few centuries to Richard III. It's somewhat bittersweet for the North to be able to claim England's most divisive king as its own. Richard was the third and last Yorkist king in the Wars of the Roses, and he seized power from a Yorkshire base. His reign was seen in the South as a northern tyranny. He gave lands and offices to northerners. But then he was defeated and killed at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485 because two key northerners, Lancashire's Thomas Lord Stanley and his brother William, deserted him. Though he was not born a northerner, it's likely that Richard spent a significant part of his teenage years in Yorkshire. As chief ally of his older brother Edward IV, Richard built an unprecedented power base among northern magnates, particularly around in the Yorkshire area, which later helped him to seize the crown. For centuries, Richard was portrayed as a power-crazed tyrant. More recently, Ricardians have sought to present him as a fair-minded, pious monarch concerned about justice. He was ambitious and at times ruthless, though perhaps no more so than many medieval kings. What sets him apart is the accusation that he ordered the killing of his two princely nephews. Many historians consider it likely that he was guilty, despite the absence of conclusive proof. Child murder offended even medieval aristocratic morality. And he had motive and opportunity, but I'm not going to pronounce on whether he was guilty or not. From the Industrial Revolution, I picked Richard Arkwright, who I did mention last time, barber and former wig maker from Preston, who invented the water frame for cotton spinning and played an important part in creating and spreading the factory system. Arkwright was one of the few inventors in the Industrial Revolution to actually become wealthy. He was the seventh surviving son of a tailor. His parents couldn't afford to send him to school, so he was taught to read and write by a cousin. He patented the spinning frame in 1769 and was later adapted to use water power. Thomas Carlyle described him as an historical phenomenon who had given England the power of cotton, enabling it to finance wars against Napoleon, without which imperial Kaisers were impotent. He could also be exasperating and arrogant. He fought legal cases against spinners who infringed his patent, in which he was alleged to have stolen the spinning frame idea from a man called Thomas Hythe. Lancashire industrialists who objected to Arkwright's high charges rejoiced when a judge refused to extend his patent. Nonetheless, as Gentleman's Magazine put it, he died immensely rich and has left manufactories, the income of which is greater than that of most German principalities. His real and personal property is estimated at little short of $500,000. This is an early Victorian heroine, Grace Darling, who rode out with her father, a lighthouse keeper, in 1838 and rescued 9 survivors after a paddle steamer ran aground on the Farne Islands off Northumberland. Her bravery made her the subject of a media frenzy. Gifts and donations flooded in, including £50 from the young Queen Victoria. People wrote requesting her signature, locks of her hair, or a piece of the garment she wore during the rescue. Some letters contained instructions for her to kiss the paper and return it. Visitors arrived in hired boats daily, hoping to see her or touch her clothes. Artists arrived to paint her portrait. It was an ordeal for the modest Grace. Sadly, Grace died of TB 4 years after the rescue, but the Victorian age had a heroine. William Wordsworth wrote a poem about the pious and pure maiden. Another writer wrote later, "She gave her thoughts and powers with conscientious diligence and perseverance to the commonplace duties of her lot, but she was none the less ready when the occasion came to go forth over the stormy waters to do a most uncommon deed of daring." Other prominent women did not always fit the mould of Victorian sensibility as easily as Grace Darling. Friedrich Engels, the German political theorist, businessman and revolutionary socialist, lived in Manchester on and off for almost 30 years. He was sent there in 1842 to work at the family cotton firm of Ehrman and Engels in Weast in Salford. His father hoped that would rid him of his radical views, which didn't work. By night, he toured Manchester's slum districts. Engels met one called Mary Burns, a fierce young Irish woman with radical opinions who worked in the Engels factory. They began a relationship that lasted 20 years until her death. Engels' book, The Condition of the Working Class in England, in 1844, published the following year in German, is a potent set of descriptions of Manchester's squalor at the height of the Industrial Revolution. Engels formed a close partnership with Karl Marx, who visited him in Manchester. They sat in a window alcove at Chetham's library and researched data that led to their Communist Manifesto. Despite his relationship with Mary, Engels considered that Irish migrants had lowered working-class morals, living standards, and wages. He said they were at home with filth and drunkenness. His views softened later, after he visited Ireland with Mary and her younger sister, Lizzie. Engels predicted that Britain would see a revolution in comparison with which the French Revolution will prove to have been child's play. He was wrong about that one. And despite his communism, Engels was the leading member of the Cheshire Fox Hunt. It's impossible to talk about the North without talking about the Bronte sisters. Charlotte, Emily, and Anne have contributed perhaps more than anyone to the world's view of Northern England. Their unsettling talents and supposedly constricted lives on the windswept moors are a constant source of fascination. All of them produce groundbreaking novels, though all of them have suffered from stereotyping, as their biographer Juliet Barker acknowledges. Charlotte is portrayed as the long-suffering victim of duty, subordinating her career to a writer to the demands of her selfish and autocratic father. Emily is the wild child of genius, deeply misanthropic, yet full of compassion for her errant brother. Anne is the quiet, conventional one who, lacking her sister's rebellious spirit, conforms to the demands of society and religion. The reality was a bit more complicated, and Charlotte herself started the process of myth-making in the way she sought to protect the posthumous reputations of her sisters, whose novels had shocked and titillated readers. Cut through these myths, however, and what remains is that all three sisters produced novels that were groundbreaking at the time and have resonance today. Charlotte's Jane Eyre is an intimate first-person narrative of great intensity that's been seen as prefiguring writers such as Marcel Proust, James Joyce, and Virginia Woolf. Emily's Wuthering Heights still has the power to divide readers, for example, over how far it's a love story and how far a portrait of a toxic relationship. For decades, Anne's literary reputation languished. That was partly down to the attitude of Charlotte, who prevented republication of The Tenant of Wildfell Hall after Anne's death. Charlotte wrote, "The choice of subject in that work is a mistake. He was too little consonant with the character, tastes, and ideas of the gentle, retiring, inexperienced writer. Anne's reputation has been rising sharply since the late 20th century. Sally MacDonald of the Bronte Society said in 2013 that in some ways Anne is now viewed as the most radical of the sisters, writing about tough subjects such as women's need to maintain independence and how alcoholism can tear a family apart." Lydia Becker from Manchester was an early leader of the women's suffrage movement, who founded and published the Women's Suffrage Journal. She and fellow campaigners won votes for women in municipal elections and places on school boards. Lydia Becker was the eldest of 15 children. Her father owned a chemical works, and her grandfather, who had come to Manchester from Germany in the late 1790s, made his money from manufacturing acid used in the cotton industry. She was also a keen botanist and promoted scientific education for girls and women. Lydia Becker, who never married, undertook onerous lecture tours on women's votes, the position of wives, female education, and rights at work, at a time when it was thought unseemly for women to speak in public. And despite being lampooned in the popular press for her stout appearance, flat face, and wire-rimmed spectacles, she gained recognition as the movement's key strategist. She arranged for the first woman to vote in a British election, a widowed shop owner called Lily Maxwell, who mistakenly appeared on the register of voters in Manchester. Spotting a chance for publicity, Lydia Becker escorted her to the polling station. Lydia Becker made women's suffrage seem achievable, and the cause was picked up by Emmeline Pankhurst, whom Becker had inspired as a teenager, and Millicent Fawcett, who was Becker's younger colleague on the London committee. Among 19th century politicians are picked Sir Robert Peel, a Conservative Prime Minister born in Bury, who repealed the Corn Laws, which were keeping the price of bread high in 1846, with Whig and Radical support, thus splitting his own party. Peel was the son of a wealthy textile manufacturer and MP, and was Britain's first Prime Minister from an industrial background. He is seen as the creator of the modern Conservative Party. As Home Secretary, he reformed and liberalised the criminal law and created the modern police force, leading to a new type of officer known in tribute to him as bobbies and peelers. As Prime Minister, he was the first to introduce an income tax at a rate of 3%. Major legislation in his time included laws to regulate coal mines, factories, and the railways. After the Irish famine of the 1840s began, his decision to join with the Whigs and Radicals to repeal the Corn Laws led to his resignation as Prime Minister in 1846. Historian A.J.P. Taylor wrote, "Peel was in the first rank of 19th century statesmen. He carried Catholic emancipation, he repealed the Corn Laws, he created the modern Conservative Party on the ruins of the old Toryism." I can't come to Wigan without mentioning George Formby Sr., who lived from 1875 to 1921, among the best known of Lancashire's rich scene of music hall comedians, billed as the Wigan Nightingale, a reference to his croaky voice. He was born into poverty in Ashton-under-Lyne, and he played characters including John Willey, an archetypal gormless Lancashire lad, accident-prone but muddling through, whose cane twirl and duck-like walk allegedly inspired Charlie Chaplin. For years, Formby battled against consumption, making light of it by muttering asides such as, "Coffin better tonight, coffin summit champion." Early in his career, a music hall owner in Birkenhead who booked him thought that his real name, James Booth, was unsuitable for the stage and suggested George Formby, George after the comedian George Roby, and Formby after the Merseyside town. Emmeline Pankhurst, the Manchester-born founder of the suffragettes, is a much admired but controversial figure. She was not tolerant of dissent within her movement, including from some of her own daughters, and she ended as a conservative. Historians differ about whether her militancy helped or hurt the women's suffrage movement, but she certainly raised its profile. She formed the Women's Social and Political Union, an all-female organisation dedicated to deeds, not words, in 1903, frustrated by the failure of suffrage bills. A Daily Mail journalist first used the diminutive term suffragette, which the movement seized as its own. At first, it engaged in peaceful activities such as rallies, but before long, members were smashing windows and assaulting police officers. Activists received repeated prison sentences and staged hunger strikes, which led to them being force-fed. Finally, the WSPU adopted arson. Yet when the First World War broke out, Emmeline halted militant action and supported the government's stand against the German peril. At rallies, her supporters handed out white feathers to any young man not in uniform. In 1918, voting rights were granted to women over 30 who met minimum property qualifications. In 1926, Emmeline joined the Conservative Party and 2 years later stood for Parliament. She put her transformation down in part to my war experience, though she may also have seen the Conservatives as the best route to secure votes for more women. In 1928, the year she died, the Conservative government passed an act extending the franchise to all persons over 21 on equal terms. George Formby Jr., son of George Formby Sr., born in 1904, was the ukulele and banjolele playing star of British comedy films in the 1930s and 1940s. He reputedly became the UK's highest paid entertainer. Born in Wigan as George Hoy Booth, and after an early career as a stable boy and jockey, Formby took to the music hall stage after his father died in 1921. His early performances were taken exclusively from his father's act, including the same songs and jokes and characters. He married a woman called Beryl Ingham, a fellow performer who became his manager and transformed his act. She insisted that he appear on stage formally dressed and introduced the ukulele to his performance. By the late 1930s, he was a film star. In George Formby's films, he portrayed a gormless Lancashire innocent who wins through in an unfamiliar environment, in horse racing, TT races, as a spy or a policeman, and wins the heart of an attractive middle-class girl, usually from the clutches of a caddish type with a moustache. Beryl regularly gave a hands-off-my-husband warning to female co-stars. The BBC banned his suggestive songs When I'm Cleaning Windows and With My Little Stick of Blackpool Rock. According to his producer, Basil Dean, George Formby didn't act gormless as many successful Lancashire comedians have done. He was gormless. Nonetheless, he managed to symbolise the working class, the people, and the nation. And whatever was thrown at him, he came through smiling, and people loved him for it. L.S. Lowry remains the artist most closely associated with the North. My ambition was to put the industrial scene on the map because nobody had seriously done it, he said. And incredibly, nobody had. He represented it so successfully that the world came to see the North through the prism of his paintings, which didn't please everyone. Lowry's industrial pictures evoke both anomie and community. People move in crowds, yet appear lonely. He also painted haunting portraits, Welsh valleys, and empty landscapes and seascapes. You don't need brains to be a painter, just feelings, he said. Although Lowry exhibited from the 1920s and had a solo London exhibition in 1939, he worked as a rent collector until retiring on his 65th birthday in 1952. His motifs, the chimney, mill, warehouse, terrace row, reflected the repetitive narrowness of factory and slum life. After the Second World War, Lowry's painting became more upbeat and including pictures of people at play as well as at work. Lowry is said to hold the record for rejecting British honours, a total of 5, including a knighthood in 1968. Ellen Wilkinson, the MP for Jarrow, played a big part in the 1936 Jarrow March of the Unemployed to London to petition for the right to work, and became Minister of Education in the 1945 Labour government. Nicknamed Red Ellen, or the fiery particle because of her red hair, she was a working-class, university-educated Mancunian who had started out on the hard left and was a founder member of the Communist Party of Great Britain. As Minister for Education, she raised the school leaving age from 14 to 15 and oversaw the creation of grammar schools and secondary moderns under the Wartime Coalition's Education Act 1944. She resisted the introduction of comprehensive schools, which were initially known as multilateral schools, favoured by some in the Labour Party, though the first comprehensive was actually created at Windermere in 1945. During the bitter winter of 1947, Ellen Wilkinson succumbed to a bronchial disease and died after an overdose of medication, which the coroner at her inquest declared was accidental. Sheila Delaney, whose A Taste of Honey was described as probably the most performed play by a post-war British woman playwright, was one of several Northern writers from modest backgrounds who came to prominence in the late 50s and early 60s. They also included Stan Barstow, John Brain, Keith Waterhouse, and David Storey. Sheila Delaney, raised in Salford, failed her 11 plus and left school at 16 to work in an engineering factory. She was aged just 19 when A Taste of Honey was first performed at London's Theatre Royal, Stratford East in 1958. She was nicknamed the Françoise Sagan of Salford, or an angry young woman, referring to the angry young man genre of John Osborne's Look Back in Anger. Sheila Delaney once said, "I had strong ideas about what I wanted to see in the theatre. We used to object to plays where the factory workers came cap in hand and called the boss sir. Usually North Country people are shown as gormless, whereas in actual fact they are very alive and cynical." And of course, there was Huddersfield-born Harold Wilson, who formed Labour governments after 4 general elections, which is more than any other leader. His honeymoon lasted for only a couple of years, 1964 to 66. After the 1967 sterling crisis, problems piled in. Wilson played on his Yorkshire pedigree, although his springboard was Merseyside, where he was first elected MP for Ormskirk in 1945 and switched to Huyton in 1950. He negotiated difficult political issues with some skill, though he had limited success in meeting his stated aims of substantially improving Britain's long-term economic performance, applying technology more democratically and reducing inequality. He took a back seat in the campaign to remain in the EU in the 1975 referendum. His advisor, Bernard Donahue, wrote that Wilson was basically a north of England nonconformist Puritan. The Continentals, especially from France and Southern Europe, were to him alien. Wilson, drinking heavily and convinced that MI5, CIA, and the South African Bureau of State Security were plotting to undermine him, resigned in 1976 and was replaced by Jim Callaghan. Wilson's reputation took a long time to recover from a low ebb after his second premiership, but he's viewed more positively today. He was operating in an economically unstable environment. He didn't achieve all his aims by any means, but there were some successes. For example, science and education spending grew very quickly, and industrial investment also rose. Victoria Wood is one of the greatest comic talents the North has produced, which is saying quite a lot. Widely admired as a stand-up comedian, singer and songwriter, TV dramatist and actor. Her observational comedy satirised British neuroses about class and sex. As a middle-class, sophisticated woman in a traditionally male world, she was unlike typical Northern comics. Her first inspiration was Joyce Grenfell. "Life's not fair, is it?" Victoria Wood once said. "Some of us drink champagne in the fast lane, and some of us eat our sandwiches by the loose chippings on the A597. As a Northerner loosening Oxbridge's dominance of comedy, she was conscious of a cultural divide. "We'd like to apologise to our viewers in the North," she wrote for the snooty TV announcer played by Susie Blake. "It must be awful for you." She was born in Prestwich and brought up in Bury, the youngest of 4 siblings. Her father was an insurance salesman who in his spare time wrote scripts for Coronation Street. Largely ignored by her parents, she spent a lot of time in her bedroom, and she lost her way at grammar school. "I'd look at other girls and wish I could be like them, interested in boys, meeting in the Wimpy bar on Saturday mornings and going to discos." She learned to play the piano and joined a youth theatre. She appeared on the talent show New Faces. Her first big break was on That's Life, writing and performing satirical songs inspired by topical events. Her first play was performed in Sheffield, and then Granada TV commissioned plays and a sketch show with her friend Julie Walters. In the following years, she mounted hugely successful stand-up tours and comedy shows, such as Victoria Wood was seen on TV, including the much-loved Acorn Antiques. There was the sitcom Dinner Ladies. Later, she focused more on serious drama, such as the award-winning TV film Housewife 49. After the breakdown in 2002 of her 20-year marriage to magician Geoffrey Durham, with whom she had 2 children and their divorce in 2003, she withdrew from the limelight for a couple of years and went into therapy. Victoria Wood was diagnosed with cancer of the esophagus and died in 2016 at her Highgate home in the presence of her children and her former husband. Anyway, that's probably enough Northerners for one evening. And it's good to finish on Victoria Wood. So I'm just going to thank you again for it's been a pleasure talking to you again. Thank you for listening to me so politely. I brought some copies of the book again. I sold a lot of them here last time, so I'm not really expecting to sell any tonight. We've only once one. It's the same routine. They're £18, which is a couple of pounds off the cover price. Has to be cash or cheque, because I've not entered the 21st century, but I do have change. There is a paperback coming, but not till late June, I'm afraid. Anyway, thanks for listening to me. Wonderful talking to you. If anybody's got any questions, I'll be very, very happy to do that.
The first chap you talked about, Venerable Dean, you said he knew the world was round, and yet it wasn't accepted that the world was round for almost 1,000 years ago.
No, it's extraordinary. Yeah.
How do you know that he knew the world was round?
Because I think, well, he worked out how, from the shadows and things and the way the tides worked, he kind of, we certainly thought it was spherical, I think. I don't know the detail of that, to be honest, but I know that he certainly didn't think it was flat. But I think he's not the only one. I think there are quite a lot of scholars who, you know.
Second part of the question there, do you think that was all pushed up, I would say, by the church, the powers that be, that didn't allow scientific knowledge?
Yeah, well, it certainly was at the time of Galileo. Yes, I think, yeah.
The one, of course, yeah.
Yeah. 1400s, yes. So it went on for the 700 years of covering up the fact that and there are still some people today who don't think it was round. No? Oh yeah, one here.
How do you know George Formby was harmless?
I quoted somebody else as it was his producer saying
I thought he was very clever.
his producer saying yes, I have no idea. I know he died in 61. And he was whether it was him or his wife, somebody was clever there. So
Yeah, they were.
Yes, they were very cleverly done.
Just answering that, George Formby, in the 30s, he was earning £5 a week, so it was certainly not fair.
It was probably a joke.
Yeah. His wife took 4,500 off him. That's that week.
Anyone else?
In the book, yeah.
Yeah.
Are there more Northern studies about it?
Yeah, there's more than 20 in there.
No, I mean, is it all to do with people?
It's a mixture. The book is a mixture of narrative history and chapters on social and cultural themes. So the first third of it pretty much straight narrative history up to the Industrial Revolution, and after that you get chapters on things like Northern women and reformers, how the language divide developed, writers and artists, the story of the North's various ethnic minorities. There's one on the importance of sheep, particularly in Yorkshire, and stuff like that. So it's a mix of it's a mix of sort of straight narrative and digression. The narrative, I probably intended to do a bit less narrative before I got into writing it, but the narrative is really compelling, and just seeing how the different parts fit. I also discovered that it had only ever been done once before, and that was in 1990, and so that seemed like an opportunity in a gap.
Painting on the top, is that Ribblesdale?
Yeah, well,
it's
I think it's I've not talked to the artist. The artist idea. I've forgotten his name now. It's on the back of the book. I've never met him or talked to him.
It looks like Ribblesdale.
I think it is the Ribblehead Viaduct.
Yeah.
But there are various other features. There is, if you look at the Ribblehead Viaduct, the mountains are not quite that behind them, and there is no TV mast. So that comes from somewhere else. It may be Emily. It's modelled on kind of 1930s images of walking books.
It's a great picture.
And the touch I particularly love is the pacer.
Yeah. What year is that?
Yeah,
Is that a diesel?
Yeah, it's only withdrawn in the last. They were only withdrawn those pacers in the last 3 or 4 years. It was a big issue that we got these crap old trains that were introduced in the 80s.
Can I ask what prompted you to write the book in terms of like you expressing yourself as a northerner because of like sort of bias towards northern people? What actually prompted you? And secondly, just a question. The emperors, I thought Claudius was the first one who allegedly came over with his elephants, and he said Adrian was the first. I thought Claudius paid a visit
to the north of England. Claudius didn't come to the north of England, as far as I know. There's one we're not so sure about, one of the later ones, I've forgotten his name now, who we know came to Britain, but we're not certain where in Britain you to. But I did them all up, and it came to at least 6. How I came to write it was it was a combination of things, really. I was a history mad kid, but I kind of went off it in my sixth form years for various reasons, and I did English at university. But I've come back to being more interested in history again as I've got older, as people often do. You start thinking about where you've come from and all that. As a journalist, I tended to specialise in regional affairs, regional British affairs, and I'm a northerner, so And journalism is a bit like watching history in real time anyway. So you put all those two things together. If you think you're writing a book, then thinking of writing history of the North was an obvious subject to look at. And as I say, started looking at and discovered it hadn't been done for ages. So I thought, well, there's a gap, something to be done there. I first thought it about 10 years ago. Unfortunately, nobody else has raced to do one before I got it out. Yeah.
Where do you think the North starts?
Well, I mean, I think it's a cultural question. The sea down two sides. The Scottish border was largely fixed in 1237 under the Treaty of York, barring a couple of changes. There is quite a big grey area in the south, and insofar as people have drawn boundaries there for one purpose or another over the centuries, these have moved around. So, for example, Cheshire is today counted as part of the Northwest for government and statistics purposes, but in Anglo-Saxon times, it was in Mercia, not in Northumbria. The Kingdom of Northumbria came down to, at its fullest, just below the Humber, and they also won the Battle of Chester, so they came down into Cheshire. Where do I think? I think certainly, to me, I certainly include the formal ones now, which include Lancashire, Cheshire, and Yorkshire. The biggest anomaly is Derbyshire, and because it's long and thin, and I think there's no way that the northern half of Derbyshire is anything other than northern. Mostly textile towns and the Pennines. Towards the Derby end, not so sure what they consider themselves to be. There's even a debate within Staffordshire. I mean, there's a whole range of areas where people sometimes are northerners when it's convenient to be northerners. Arnold Bennett wrote he's from Stoke, who called his first novel A Man from the North. Probably thought it'd sell more copies than A Man from the West Midlands. But there's a debate even within Staffordshire that a lot of them seem to regard Mow Cop halfway up as the dividing line, and see Stoke as in the Midlands, but all the bits to the north of that as in the north. In the Middle Ages, the royal administration liked to divide it along the Trent, except I discovered it wasn't quite the Trent, it goes slightly south of the river. And for centuries, the students at the universities of Oxford and Cambridge, which at the time the only universities, divided themselves into northerners and southerners, and there are regular fights and riots between these groups right up to the 16th century. So there's a long history. Okay. I think we're done. I don't know more.
Pete Marsh. You said a couple of years before he was discovered, there was a female Scotland.
Lindo woman, yes.
Why was that not as famous? Was it not as well preserved?
I don't know. I imagine this story was that it wasn't such a well-preserved body. That would be my guess.
Yeah.
And it's not on display now. When Pete Marsh first came out, he was on display at the Manchester Museum. And I was living in Scotland at the time, but we took our kids to see that. And I went to see him again recently. I was writing the book, and he's in the British Museum now. Thank you very much.